The morning air was crisp as Ray hunched under his worn blanket. At 47, his weathered face told stories of better days long gone. 3 years on the streets had taught him to find warmth wherever he could. Today, that meant the small park across from the towering glass buildings of the financial district. Ray hadn't always lived this way. Once, he'd had a home, a job as a construction worker, and a family who loved him. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns. First came the workplace injury that left him unable to climb scaffolding. Then medical bills piled up. His wife couldn't handle the stress and left, taking their young son with her. One misfortune led to another until Ray found himself with nothing but a backpack of belongings and nowhere to call home. Despite everything, Ray maintained his dignity. He never begged. Instead, he collected recyclables and did odd jobs when his back permitted. He kept himself as clean as possible using public restrooms and the shower at a local shelter when beds weren't available. Most importantly, he held on to his humanity, greeting passers-by with a gentle nod and helping fellow homeless folks whenever he could. Another day, Ray muttered to himself as he folded his blanket and tucked it into his backpack. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday noon. The community center 3 blocks away served breakfast at 7:30. If he hurried, he might beat the line. As Ray walked, he noticed the usual morning hustle of the city. Men and women in expensive suits rushed by with coffee cups in hand, barely glancing his way. He'd become invisible to them, just another fixture of urban poverty they'd trained themselves not to see. Among the morning crowd was Thomas Chen, though Ray didn't know his name then. Thomas was the founder and CEO of NextGen Technologies, worth an estimated $2.3 billion according to business magazines. At 52, Thomas had everything money could buy: a penthouse apartment at the top of one of those glass towers, a collection of sports cars, vacation homes on 3 continents, and more wealth than he could spend in several lifetimes. But Thomas also had something money couldn't protect: his 17-year-old daughter, Lily. She was his world, especially since his wife had died from cancer 5 years earlier. That morning, Thomas had dropped Lily off at their penthouse after picking her up from a friend's sleepover, before heading to an early meeting. "I'll be back for dinner," Thomas had told Lily. "Don't forget you have that college interview preparation at 4. Lily had nodded, already plugging in her earbuds. "Sure, Dad. Have a good meeting." Thomas hadn't known those might be the last words they'd exchange. Ray had just reached the end of the park when he heard a distant alarm. Fire trucks wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. He turned to see smoke billowing from the upper floors of one of the glass towers, the very one Thomas Chen had left just 30 minutes earlier. People poured out of the building's main entrance, coughing and disoriented. Emergency responders arrived, cordoning off the area and helping evacuate the remaining occupants. Ray stood watching, the breakfast at the community center forgotten. "My daughter." A frantic voice cut through the chaos. Ray turned to see a man in an expensive suit pushing against the police barrier. "My daughter is still up there. Penthouse level." Ray recognized the man from newspaper photos. Everyone in the city knew Thomas Chen, the tech billionaire. The police were holding him back as firefighters explained that the upper floors were inaccessible, the fire had started on the mechanical level, and the elevators were shut down. The stairwell access to the top 3 floors was blocked by flames. "We're working on an aerial rescue," one firefighter was saying. "But the helicopter will take time to arrive. She could be dead by then." Thomas shouted, his composed business persona completely shattered by panic. Ray felt something stir within him. He knew what it was like to lose family. The desperate look in Thomas's eyes reminded him of how he felt when he'd lost contact with his own son. Without fully thinking it through, Ray circled around the barricade. He'd worked construction in buildings like this one. He knew these towers often had maintenance access routes that bypassed standard stairwells, service ladders and utility corridors that workers use to access mechanical systems. Ray slipped through a side entrance where confused residents were still exiting. Against the flow of evacuees, he made his way to a utility door he spotted behind a decorative column. His years in construction had taught him that such doors were often overlooked in emergencies but rarely locked from the inside due to fire safety regulations. The door opened to a narrow service corridor. Ray moved quickly, ignoring the pain in his back. He found a maintenance ladder that ran alongside the elevator shafts. It would be a long climb to the penthouse level, but it might bypass the flames consuming the main stairwell. Ray began to climb. The metal rungs dug into his calloused hands. Sweat soaked through his layers of clothing. Smoke grew thicker as he ascended, forcing him to pull his shirt over his mouth and nose. His lungs burned, and his muscles screamed for him to stop. But he kept going, rung after rung, floor after floor. Meanwhile, Thomas Chen was frantic outside the building. The fire chief had told him the aerial rescue was still 15 minutes out. Too long. Much too long. Thomas had tried calling Lily repeatedly, but there was no answer. Please, Thomas begged anyone who would listen. I'll give anything, to whoever can save my daughter. But the professionals knew better than to make promises they couldn't keep. The fire had spread rapidly through the upper levels of the building. The situation looked increasingly grim. Inside, Ray finally reached the service door that should lead to the penthouse level. The metal door was hot to the touch. Ray wrapped his hand in the edge of his jacket and pushed it open. A wall of heat and smoke hit him immediately. The luxurious penthouse was in chaos. Flames licked at expensive furniture, and thick smoke obscured visibility beyond a few feet. Ray dropped to his hands and knees, where the air was marginally clearer. Hello? Ray called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Is anyone here? Call out if you can hear me. For several terrifying moments, there was no response. Ray began to crawl through the apartment, checking rooms one by one. The contrast between this place and his usual surroundings wasn't lost on him. Even in a state of destruction, the penthouse contained more wealth than he'd seen in years. Then, faintly, he heard coughing from behind a closed door. Ray made his way toward the sound, finding a bedroom door that was jammed shut. With a surge of adrenaline, he rammed his shoulder against it once, twice, a third time until it gave way. Inside, a teenage girl was huddled in the corner of the room, a wet towel pressed to her face. She looked up at Ray with terror in her eyes. I'm here to help, Ray said, extending his hand. Your father sent me. We need to go now. Lily hesitated, eyeing the stranger suspiciously despite the dire circumstances. There's no time, Ray insisted. The building is burning. Do you want to live? That seemed to snap Lily out of her hesitation. She grabbed Ray's hand, and he led her back toward the service ladder. The main exit was completely engulfed in flames now, and the heat was becoming unbearable. We have to go down this maintenance ladder, Ray explained. It's a long way, but it's our only chance. I'll go first, and you follow right behind me. Keep one hand on my shoulder if you can. Lily nodded, terror evident in her eyes but determination there too. The descent was even harder than the climb up. Ray's muscles were already exhausted, and now he had to move carefully to ensure Lily was safe behind him. The smoke was disorienting, making it difficult to see the rungs below. Several times, Ray's foot slipped, sending spikes of panic through both of them. About halfway down, Ray heard a cracking sound above them. He looked up to see debris falling from where they'd just been. A piece of burning material struck his shoulder, searing through his jacket and into his skin. Ray bit back a scream, not wanting to frighten Lily more than she already was. Keep moving, he encouraged her. We're going to make it. Floor by floor, they descended through the smoke and heat. Ray's vision began to blur, his lungs protesting each breath. But he forced himself to continue. Just a few more floors. Then a few more. Until finally, mercifully, they reached the ground level. Ray pushed open the service door, and they stumbled out into a service corridor. Following exit signs, they made their way toward daylight. Ray's legs nearly gave out beneath him, but the knowledge that safety was just ahead kept him moving. When they finally emerged from a side exit of the building, emergency workers rushed toward them immediately. Lily was whisked away to a waiting ambulance, an oxygen mask placed over her face. Ray collapsed onto the pavement, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Through blurry vision, Ray saw Thomas Chen running toward the ambulance, embracing his daughter with desperate relief. The last thing Ray remembered before losing consciousness was a paramedic leaning over him, saying words he couldn't quite make out. What Ray didn't know as darkness claimed him was that this act of courage would change his life forever. And that Thomas Chen, watching his daughter receive medical attention while catching glimpses of the homeless man who'd saved her, was already making plans that would give Ray's story an ending no one could have predicted. Ray opened his eyes to the steady beep of hospital monitors. The ceiling above him was clean and white, so different from the underpasses and park benches where he usually woke. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming, or worse, dead. "He's awake," a nurse called out, appearing in his field of vision with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling, sir?" Ray tried to speak, but his throat burned. The nurse offered him water, carefully helping him sip through a straw. His body ached everywhere, especially his shoulder where the burning debris had struck him. "You've been out for almost 2 days, the nurse explained. Smoke inhalation and second-degree burns on your shoulder. You're lucky to be alive." Ray's memory slowly returned, the fire, the climb, the girl. Had she survived? Had it all been worth it? As if reading his thoughts, the nurse added, "The girl you saved is fine. She was treated for minor smoke inhalation and released the same day." Relief washed over Ray. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace. He'd done something good. Something that mattered. Later that afternoon, Ray was sitting up in bed flipping through channels on the room's television, a luxury he hadn't enjoyed in years, when the door opened. He expected another nurse or doctor, but instead, Thomas Chen walked in, followed by his daughter Lily. Thomas stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, emotion evident on his face. In his designer suit, he looked out of place in the sterile hospital room. Lily stayed close to her father, but her eyes were fixed on Ray with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "They told me you were awake," Thomas finally said, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. I don't even know how to begin thanking you." Ray shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Thomas said firmly. "They wouldn't. The firefighters couldn't reach her. I couldn't reach her. You were the only one who tried." His voice broke slightly. "You saved my daughter's life." Lily stepped forward then, her eyes shining with tears. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of a life restored. Ray nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He'd saved someone's child. He thought of his own son, wondering where he was now, if he was safe. Thomas pulled a chair next to Ray's bed and sat down. "The doctors tell me you'll make a full recovery, but it will take time. They also mentioned you listed no fixed address on your intake forms." Ray looked away, shame washing over him. Here it came, the moment when gratitude would give way to judgment. "I want to help you," Thomas continued, surprising Ray. "Not just as repayment, but because you deserve a chance. Everyone deserves a chance." Thomas explained that he'd spent the past 2 days learning everything he could about Ray. He'd discovered Ray's work history in construction, his injury, and how he'd ended up on the streets. He'd even managed to track down Ray's ex-wife and learned that his son was now 16 and living in another state. "I own several construction companies," Thomas said. "One of them specializes in sustainable housing development. They need a site supervisor, someone who understands the work from the ground up and can manage teams effectively." Ray stared at him in disbelief. "You want to offer me a job? You don't even know me." "I know you risked your life to save a stranger," Thomas replied. "That tells me everything important about your character." The offer wasn't charity, Thomas insisted. The position came with training, a competitive salary, and benefits including health insurance that would cover Ray's ongoing physical therapy for his back. "And there's more," Thomas added. "I've arranged temporary housing for you while you recover. After that, if the job works out, we can discuss more permanent options." Ray sat in stunned silence. After years of people averting their eyes as they passed him on the street, after countless rejections when his address field on applications remained blank, after giving up hope that his life would ever change, here was a door opening. "Why?" Ray finally managed to ask. "Why go to all this trouble?" Thomas glanced at his daughter, then back at Ray. "Because you showed me that even when we lose sight of our common humanity, it's still there. And because I have a feeling that before the fire, I wasn't seeing clearly. Maybe none of us were." Ray looked down at his bandaged hands, rough from years on the street. Could they build again? Could they create instead of just surviving? "When do I start?" he asked, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. 3 weeks later, Ray stood before the mirror in his temporary apartment, hardly recognizing the man who stared back at him. The new clothes Thomas had arranged for him fit well: work boots, durable jeans, and a button-up shirt. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face cleanly shaven. The burn on his shoulder was healing, though the doctor said it would leave a scar. "A reminder," Ray murmured to himself, tracing the edge of the bandage. "A reminder of the day everything changed." The apartment was modest but felt palatial after years on the street, a one-bedroom unit in a decent neighborhood, with furniture Thomas had arranged. Ray still found himself waking up disoriented, momentarily panicking about where he was before remembering this new reality. Today was his first day at the construction site. Thomas had been true to his word, setting up the job once Ray was cleared by doctors for light duty. Ray's hands trembled slightly as he grabbed his own keys to his own door. The weight of them in his pocket still felt foreign. Outside, a company truck was waiting. Thomas had arranged for a senior foreman named Joe to pick Ray up and show him the ropes for the first few weeks. "Ready for this?" Joe asked as Ray climbed into the passenger seat. "As I'll ever be," Ray replied, trying to mask his nervousness. The construction site was bustling when they arrived. It was a mixed-use development, affordable housing units above community spaces. Joe introduced Ray to the crew as they toured the site. Some of the workers gave Ray curious looks. They'd seen the news stories about the homeless hero and the billionaire's daughter. "You're the guy, aren't you?" one worker finally asked during their lunch break. "The one who saved Chen's kid?" Ray nodded uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing." The worker extended his hand. "That's something, man. That's really something." By day's end, Ray's back ached, but it was a different kind of pain than he'd known on the streets, the good kind that came from purposeful work. Joe seemed pleased with Ray's knowledge and input throughout the day. "You know your stuff," Joe commented as they drove back. "Chen said you were experienced, but I wasn't sure what to expect." "Been doing construction since I was 19, Ray replied. "At least until my back gave out." Joe nodded. "Well, as site supervisor, you won't be doing the heavy lifting. You'll be using this," he tapped his temple, "more than your muscles. I think you'll do just fine." That evening, Ray sat at his small kitchen table, eating a proper home-cooked meal, another luxury he was still getting used to. His phone buzzed with a text message. Thomas had given him a smartphone, insisting it was necessary for the job. How was the first day? Thomas had written. Ray typed back slowly, still unaccustomed to the touch screen. Good. Thank you. The reply came quickly. Lily's been asking about you. Would you join us for dinner this weekend? Ray stared at the message. Dinner with a billionaire? In what world did that make sense? Yet here he was, with a job and an apartment, all because he'd done what any decent person would do. Okay, he typed back simply. The next morning, Ray received another surprise. A letter had arrived, forwarded through Thomas's office. The return address made his heart skip a beat. It was from his ex-wife. With shaking hands, Ray tore open the envelope. Inside was a brief note and a photograph of a teenage boy with Ray's eyes. Found out what you did from the news, the note read. Andy's been asking about you. Call if you want to talk. Ray sank onto the couch, the photograph clutched in his trembling fingers. His son. His boy. The child he thought he'd lost forever. That night, Ray sat on the balcony of his small apartment, gazing at the city lights. 3 weeks ago, he'd been invisible, another nameless face struggling to survive. Now, he had a job, a home, and the possibility of reconnecting with his son. And it had all started with a choice, to climb those stairs, to face the fire, to help a stranger. The Chen family home was nothing like Ray had imagined. Instead of the cold, ultra-modern mansion he'd expected, it was a spacious but surprisingly cozy penthouse in a different building than the one that had caught fire. Thomas explained they'd moved temporarily while their home was being restored. Ray stood awkwardly in the entryway, clutching a small bouquet of flowers he'd bought for Lily. He'd spent 20 minutes in the store, agonizing over what was appropriate. In the end, a kind florist had helped him select something simple and cheerful. You didn't have to bring anything, Thomas said, welcoming him inside. My mother raised me better than that, Ray replied, the word surprising him. He hadn't thought about his mother's lessons in etiquette for years. Lily appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw Ray. In the hospital, she'd been quiet and still in shock. Today, she seemed more herself, a typical teenager in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. These are for you, Ray said, extending the flowers. To celebrate your recovery. They're beautiful, Lily said, taking them with a genuine smile. I'll put them in water. Dinner was less awkward than Ray had feared. Thomas had ordered from a local restaurant, nothing too fancy, just good food served family style. As they ate, Thomas and Lily drew Ray out of his shell, asking about his first week at work, his apartment, his adjustment to this new chapter. The crew seems to respect you already, Thomas noted. Joe says you've got good instincts with the team. Ray shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. It's familiar territory. Just rusty. As the evening progressed, Ray found himself relaxing. These people didn't see him as a charity case or a homeless man. They treated him like a guest, like someone worthy of their time and conversation. After dinner, Lily asked about the letter from his ex-wife. Ray had mentioned it briefly to Thomas earlier in the week. Have you called her yet? She asked. Ray shook his head. Not yet. I'm nervous, I guess. It's been 7 years. Dad was scared to talk to me for months after Mom died, Lily said matter-of-factly. He'd leave notes and texts but could barely have a conversation. Thomas looked surprised at his daughter's candor, but Lily continued. Sometimes the important conversations are the hardest ones, she said with wisdom beyond her years. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. Later, as Thomas walked Ray to the elevator, he seemed thoughtful. She's right, you know, Thomas said quietly. About the hard conversations. When my wife died, I buried myself in work rather than face my grief or help Lily with hers. It nearly cost me my relationship with my daughter. Ray nodded, understanding. I've been thinking about what to say to my son for years. Now that I actually have the chance, words fail me. Start with hello, Thomas suggested. The rest will come. That night, sitting in his apartment, Ray finally gathered his courage and dialed the number his ex-wife had included in her letter. His heart pounded as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? A woman's voice, older, but unmistakably belonging to Jenny, his ex-wife. It's me, Ray said, his voice rough with emotion. It's Ray. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of absence. I wasn't sure you'd call, Jenny finally said. I wasn't sure you'd answer, Ray admitted. Another pause, less tense this time. Andy saw you on the news, Jenny said. He couldn't believe his dad was a hero. Ray closed his eyes at the mention of his son. I'm not a hero. I just did what seemed right. That sounds like the Ray I used to know, Jenny replied softly. They talked for almost an hour, carefully at first, then with growing ease. Jenny told him about Andy's school, his interest in basketball, his questions about his father that had become more frequent as he grew older. Would you like to talk to him? Jenny asked eventually. He's in his room. I could call him. Ray gripped the phone tighter, tears welling in his eyes. Yes, he whispered. I'd like that very much. As he waited for his son to come to the phone, Ray looked around at his small apartment, at the new life taking shape around him. One decision, one moment of courage, had set off a chain reaction he could never have foreseen. And the greatest rewards were still unfolding. Dad? Is it really you? The voice on the phone was unfamiliar, deeper than Ray remembered, with the cracking uncertainty of adolescence. But the word Dad hit Ray like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it directed at him in 7 years. Yeah, buddy. It's me. Ray's voice broke as he struggled to contain his emotion. You've grown up. Mom says you saved someone from a fire, Andy said, his tone a mixture of awe and caution. Ray searched for the right words. How could he explain everything to this boy, now almost a young man, who had every right to resent him for his absence? I did, Ray said simply. But I've missed a lot more important things. Like watching you grow up. They talked awkwardly at first, then with growing animation as Andy described his basketball team, his classes, his friends. Ray listened hungrily, trying to piece together the years he'd lost. Do you think I could see you sometime? Ray finally asked, bracing himself for rejection. The pause that followed seemed endless. Yeah, Andy said finally. I think I'd like that. When the call ended, Ray sat motionless, overwhelmed by possibility. His son wanted to see him. After all this time, after everything that had happened, he had a chance to be a father again. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and preparation. Ray threw himself into his job, impressing Thomas and earning the respect of his crew. The burns on his shoulder healed, leaving a scar that Ray wore as a reminder of his second chance at life. The apartment began to feel like home. Ray added small touches, a plant on the windowsill, a basketball poster on the wall in anticipation of Andy's visit. For the first time in years, he was building something that felt permanent. Thomas checked in regularly, not as a benefactor but increasingly as a friend. The billionaire seemed to find something refreshing in Ray's straightforward nature, his lack of agenda when it came to Thomas's wealth. I've been thinking, Thomas said during one of their conversations. The housing development you're supervising, it's part of a larger initiative my company started last year. Ray nodded, familiar with the project's goals of creating affordable housing in neighborhoods where working families were being priced out. People like you, with practical experience and real understanding of hardship, we need more of that perspective in the planning stages, Thomas continued. Would you be interested in joining the development committee? It comes with a raise and more responsibility. The offer stunned Ray. You're serious? Completely, Thomas replied. You've proven yourself these past weeks. But more importantly, you see things differently than most of my executives. That's valuable. Ray accepted, still somewhat in disbelief. The homeless man who'd been invisible on the streets was now helping shape housing policy for one of the city's largest developers. 1 month after the fire, Ray stood nervously at the train station, scanning the crowd for faces he wasn't sure he'd recognize. Jenny had agreed to bring Andy for a weekend visit, the first step in rebuilding their relationship. Ray spotted them before they saw him, a woman with graying hair that had once been blonde, and beside her, a gangly teenager who carried himself with the awkward pride of a boy becoming a man. For a moment, Ray considered running. What right did he have to re-enter their lives? What if he disappointed them again? Then Andy turned and saw him. The boy froze, staring at the father who had been absent for nearly half his life. Ray forced himself to stand his ground, to face whatever came next, anger, resentment, or perhaps, if he was very lucky, forgiveness. Andy broke into a run, pushing through the crowd. Before Ray could prepare himself, his son crashed into him with the force of 7 years of absence, wrapping long arms around him in a fierce hug. You look different than on TV, Andy mumbled against Ray's shoulder. Ray held his son tightly, feeling the years between them both stretching and collapsing in that embrace. I am different, Ray said softly. And I'm trying to be better. Jenny approached more slowly, her expression guarded but not cold. She gave Ray a small nod of acknowledgement, not forgiveness yet, but a willingness to see who he had become. As the three of them left the station together, Ray realized that of all the rewards Thomas Chen had given him, this moment, this chance to rebuild his broken family, was the most unbelievable gift of all. The weekend with Andy passed too quickly. They played basketball at a nearby court, went to a movie, and talked for hours. Ray listened more than he spoke, soaking in the details of his son's life, his struggle with math, his dreams of college, his first crush on a girl in his biology class. Jenny kept her distance, dropping Andy off each morning and picking him up in the evenings. But on the final day, she accepted Ray's invitation to come in for coffee while Andy packed his things. You've changed, she said, looking around the modest but tidy apartment. Had to, Ray replied. Hit rock bottom and realized I was digging. Jenny nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had seen him at his worst, after the injury when pain and depression had led to pills, then drinking, then the slow unraveling of their life together. Andy talks about nothing but you, she said. He's already asking when he can visit again. Hope swelled in Ray's chest. Anytime. Every weekend if he wants. I can come there too, if that's easier. Jenny studied him for a long moment. Let's take it slow. But yes, I think regular visits would be good for him. For both of you. As they said goodbye at the train station, Andy hugged Ray fiercely. Dad, can I come back for spring break? Mom says it's okay if you say yes. Ray looked at Jenny, who gave a slight nod. Nothing would make me happier, he told his son. Watching the train pull away, Ray felt a curious mixture of loss and fulfillment. They were gone, but not forever. Not this time. At work the next day, Ray threw himself into his new responsibilities. The development committee role came with an office, small, but with a door and a window that looked out over the city. Ray could hardly believe this space belonged to him. Thomas had also arranged for Ray to take night classes in project management and sustainable development. The coursework was challenging after so many years away from education, but Ray found he enjoyed the mental exercise. You're a natural, Thomas told him after Ray presented his first proposal to the committee, a modification to their current housing project that would include a community garden and workshop space where residents could learn skills and build community. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. 3 months after the fire, Ray moved into a permanent apartment, a one-bedroom unit in one of Thomas's recently completed affordable housing buildings. The rent was reasonable, subsidized by a program Thomas had started for working families. Ray insisted on paying his fair share, not willing to accept charity even from Thomas. The day after he moved in, Ray received an unexpected visitor. Lily Chen stood at his door, holding a small houseplant. "Dad told me you moved," she said with a smile. "Housewarming gift." Ray invited her in, scrambling to offer her a drink in his barely unpacked kitchen. Lily waved away his concern, settling comfortably on his sofa. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, her expression serious. "Not just for saving my life, but for what you've done for my dad." Ray looked at her in confusion. "I haven't done anything for your father. He's the one who's helped me." Lily shook her head. "Before the fire, Dad was different. After Mom died, he just worked and worked. He stopped seeing people as people, they were either useful to his business or they weren't. But you changed that." She explained how Thomas had thrown himself into the affordable housing initiative after the fire, expanding its budget and scope. He'd started a foundation to address homelessness in the city. Most surprisingly, he'd begun having dinner with Lily every night, no matter how busy his schedule. "He says you reminded him what matters," Lily concluded. "That all his money meant nothing when he thought he'd lost me. And that someone with nothing still gave everything to help a stranger." Ray sat in stunned silence. He'd been so focused on how Thomas had changed his life, he'd never considered that the influence might go both ways. "The funny thing about kindness," Lily said thoughtfully, "is that it works in circles, not lines. You helped us, Dad helped you, and now you're both helping others." As Lily left, Ray stood in the doorway of his new home, contemplating her words. From the depths of homelessness to this moment, his journey had been unimaginable. Yet somehow, he still felt he was just beginning. 6 months after the fire, Ray stood at the podium, uncomfortable in his new suit as he faced the crowd gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony. The project was the largest yet for Thomas's affordable housing initiative, a mixed-use development that would provide homes for over 200 families, along with community spaces, job training facilities, and a health clinic. And Ray was now the project director. "I'm not much for public speaking," Ray began, his voice rough with emotion. "A year ago, I was sleeping on park benches, invisible to most of the people walking by. Today, I'm helping build homes for families who need them. Life can change in an instant, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes, if we're lucky, for the better." In the front row, Thomas nodded encouragingly. Beside him sat Lily, who had become a regular visitor to Ray's apartment, often bringing homework questions or simply stopping by to chat. At 17, she was preparing for college and had developed an interest in social policy, inspired partly by Ray's story. Also in the audience were Jenny and Andy, who had come for the ceremony and would be staying with Ray for the weekend. Andy was proudly wearing a hard hat that Ray had given him during his last visit, a symbol of the future Ray hoped his son might consider. The boy had shown a surprising interest in construction and design during his visits, poring over Ray's project plans and asking thoughtful questions. "This development isn't just about buildings," Ray continued, warming to his topic despite his nervousness. "It's about second chances. Every apartment represents a family with a chance to stabilize, to put down roots, to build a future. I know what that means because I've lived both sides, the desperation of homelessness and the hope that comes with having a door you can close against the world." As Ray spoke, he caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, former co-workers from his construction days who had reached out after seeing his story on the news, current team members who had come to respect his leadership, even a few people he recognized from his time on the streets. One older man in particular caught his eye, Doug, who had shown Ray the ropes when he'd first become homeless, teaching him which shelters were safest and which public bathrooms stayed open late. Ray had found Doug last month, still living under the same overpass. He'd offered him a job as a site security guard, a position with regular hours, decent pay, and an apartment in the building once it was completed. Doug had accepted with tears in his eyes. After the ceremony, as people mingled and congratulated him, Ray found himself face to face with a reporter. "Mr. Walker, your story has inspired so many people," she said, microphone extended. "From homeless to heading a major development project in just 6 months, it sounds like a fairy tale. What would you say to others struggling on the streets right now?" Ray thought carefully before answering. "I'd say that every person out there has value, skills, and a story. Most just need what I got, a chance to show what they can do and someone willing to see them as people, not problems." He glanced over at Thomas, who was watching with approval. "And I'd say that giving someone a chance to rebuild their life is the greatest gift possible." The reporter nodded, clearly moved. "And what's next for you, Mr. Walker?" Ray looked around at the gathered crowd, his son, his ex-wife who was slowly becoming a friend again, the Chen family, his colleagues, and Doug, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. "Next." Ray smiled. "I'm just getting started." 1 year to the day after the fire, Ray stood on the rooftop garden of the newly completed housing development. The evening air was cool, and strings of lights twinkled overhead, illuminating the faces of guests gathered for the building's official opening. Thomas had insisted on marking the anniversary, though Ray would have preferred less fanfare. Still, looking around at what they'd accomplished, Ray couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. The building wasn't just a structure of concrete and steel, it was a community taking shape before his eyes. 30% of the units had been set aside for formerly homeless individuals and families, with support services built into the community. Doug had moved in last week, along with several others Ray had known from his time on the streets. Each had been offered not just housing but employment opportunities and a genuine chance at stability. "There you are," Thomas said, joining Ray at the railing where he stood overlooking the city. "Hiding from your own party?" Ray smiled. "Just taking it in. It's a lot to process." In the past year, their relationship had evolved from benefactor and recipient to something closer to friendship. Thomas had taught Ray about business and development, while Ray had reminded Thomas about the human impact of his corporate decisions. "Lily's looking for you," Thomas said. "She wants a picture with her hero before she heads off to college next month." Ray shook his head, still uncomfortable with the label. "I'm nobody's hero." "Tell that to her," Thomas replied. "Or to them." He gestured toward the gathering, where residents mingled with investors and city officials. Ray spotted Jenny and Andy among the crowd. They had moved to the city 2 months ago, after Jenny had accepted a job at the community health clinic that was part of the development. Andy would be starting his senior year at the local high school, now living just 20 minutes from Ray's apartment. It wasn't the family reunion Ray might have once imagined. Jenny had made it clear they wouldn't be getting back together, but it was something better than he'd dared to hope for. They were building a new kind of family, one based on forgiveness and second chances. A hush fell over the crowd as the mayor stepped up to the microphone. "Today we celebrate not just a building, but a vision of what our city can be when we recognize the dignity and potential in every citizen," she began. Ray listened as she praised the innovative approach of the development, noting how it was already being studied as a model for other cities. "But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story," the mayor continued, "is the journey of the project's director, Ray Walker, who went from homelessness to leadership in just 1 year, proving that talent and determination can be found in every corner of our community." Applause erupted, and Ray felt Thomas nudge him forward. Reluctantly, he made his way to the podium. Looking out at the faces turned toward him, his son beaming with pride, Jenny with quiet approval, Lily recording the moment on her phone, Doug standing tall in his new uniform, and Thomas nodding encouragement, Ray felt a sense of completion he'd never thought possible. "A year ago, I risked my life running into a burning building," Ray said simply. It seemed like madness at the time. But sometimes, the greatest risks bring the greatest rewards. He paused, emotion tightening his throat. I didn't just save a life that day, he continued. In a way, I found my own. And now, together, we're building something that will help others find theirs. As the crowd applauded, Ray caught Thomas's eye. The billionaire raised his glass in a silent toast, not from benefactor to recipient, but from one man to another, equals in the most important ways. What had begun with a split-second decision to climb a burning stairwell had transformed not just Ray's life, but countless others. And that, Ray realized, was the true reward, not what he had gained, but what he could now give back.